The photograph slipped from my fingers the moment I saw Evelyn's face in my father's album. I had held guns steadier than that. I had signed death orders without blinking. But that small square of faded paper, tucked between brittle black pages that smelled like dust and cedar, struck harder than any bullet ever had. My thumb froze over the edge. My pulse kicked once, then again, loud enough to drown out the grandfather clock in the library. The woman in the picture was younger, maybe 6 or 7, standing beside a dark-haired woman whose smile looked careful, almost afraid. And there, kneeling beside them with one hand on the little girl's shoulder, was my father, not posing with strangers, protecting them. I stared until the details stopped feeling like details and started feeling like evidence. Evelyn's eyes were the same eyes that looked up from my office desk every morning, steady, guarded, too intelligent to miss anything. The small birthmark near her left brow was there too, faint even in the old print, but unmistakable. My secretary. In my house. In my family's private album. A woman I was certain I had never met before she walked into my office 3 years ago with a resume and a voice too calm for the world she had stepped into. My hand tightened around the page. Who had she been to him? The library around me seemed to draw inward. Dark walnut shelves climbed to the ceiling. Firelight moved across the polished floor in restless bands. The leather chair behind my father's old desk sat empty, as if it had been waiting for this exact betrayal of silence. I turned the page too fast and nearly tore it. More photographs. A hospital room. A baby wrapped in a white blanket. A woman whose face was half turned away. My father again. Younger, harder, but with something in his expression I had never seen in life. Fear. That frightened me more than the picture itself. My father had feared very little. Not police raids. Not rival families. Not prison. Certainly not secrets. Yet whatever this was, he had hidden it inside an album no one touched, inside a room even the estate staff entered only to dust. If Evelyn had been part of this house once, then someone had erased her. Deliberately. Thoroughly. And somehow she had come back into my life without either of us knowing why. I heard heels in the hallway. Not hurried. Measured. Familiar. Evelyn. For one strange second, instinct told me to close the album and lock the truth back in the dark. That was the old instinct, the one built for survival, for control, for deciding what others were allowed to know. But this was already bigger than control. This was blood and history and a lie that had lived longer than my father. So I left the album open. The door eased inward. Evelyn stepped in with a folder in one hand, ready to speak, then stopped when she saw my face. Her posture changed first, not her expression. I had seen that before. She never flinched where others did. She braced. You said you needed the estate records signed. My voice came out lower than I expected. Come here. She did not move at once. Her gaze dropped to the desk, to the album, to the single photograph I had pulled free. Something unreadable crossed her face. Not recognition. Not yet. Something closer to absence, like a memory reaching for her from behind locked glass. Then she walked toward me. Each step sounded too loud on the wood floor. She set the folder down without breaking eye contact, and I watched the exact moment she saw the picture clearly. The color drained from her face. Her fingers touched the desk edge, not for drama, but because her body suddenly needed support. She whispered one word. No. That single syllable hit the room harder than a confession. I slid the photograph toward her. Tell me why my father is in a family picture with you. She looked at the image as if it might burn her. The silence after that question felt heavier than the oak desk between us. Rain pressed softly against the tall windows of my office, and the yellow light from the banker's lamp turned the old photograph into something almost alive. Evelyn Hart did not reach for it right away. She kept her fingers braced on the desk, knuckles pale, breathing shallow, as if one wrong inhale might pull her into a year she had spent her whole life trying to bury. When she finally looked up at me, there was no calculation in her face. No practiced excuse. No quick lie to protect her job. What I saw instead was fear sharpened by recognition. I know that man, she said. Not my father. Not Adrian Voss's father. That man. The distinction landed hard. I stayed still in my chair, but every instinct in me tightened. In my world, hesitation got people killed, memories got weaponized, and secrets that surfaced this late were almost never innocent. Yet nothing about Evelyn Hart looked manipulative. She looked cornered by the truth itself. Start at the beginning, I said. Her eyes dropped back to the photograph. My father stood there 25 years younger, one hand resting on the shoulder of a woman seated beside him. In the foreground, a little girl was half turned toward the camera, blurry from movement, smiling at someone outside the frame. That child had the same eyes now staring at the image in my office. My mother kept one picture hidden in a sewing box. Evelyn Hart said quietly. Just one. I found it when I was 9. She took it away from me so fast I thought I'd done something wrong. Her voice roughened, but I remembered his face. I never forgot it. A cold current moved through me. The room seemed to narrow around that single admission. Not because it proved anything yet, because it made coincidence feel impossible. I pushed the photo closer. Why would my father be in a picture your mother hid? She swallowed, and for the first time since stepping into my office, she chose to do something dangerous. Tell me the part that could destroy her. Because she told me, once, when she was sick and thought she might not wake up, that a powerful family helped us disappear. The words hung there. Disappear. That was not the language of charity. That was the language of threat, protection, blood, and payment. I knew it too well. If this story was true, then my father had not simply known her family. He had hidden them. From who? I asked. Her jaw tightened. She never said. I begged her for names, but every time she started, she panicked. She said the less I knew, the longer I would live. The air in my office seemed to lose all warmth. That sentence did not belong to ordinary people with ordinary troubles. It belonged to people fleeing men like the one I had spent my life becoming. I rose from my chair and crossed to the bar cart by the bookshelf, more to think than to drink. Crystal clinked softly as I poured water into a glass. My reflection in the dark window looked like a stranger wearing my face. Tailored black suit, steel cuff links, hands that had signed death warrants without trembling. Yet behind me stood a woman who had worked 3 floors below me for 19 months, taking dictation, organizing schedules, answering calls, never once showing that my family's ghost lived inside her memory. I handed her the glass. She took it with both hands. That small act changed something in the room. If you've ever seen a secret crack open in real time, you know the next truth never arrives gently. My mother made me promise something, Evelyn Hart said after a sip. If I ever saw that man again, I was supposed to run. I felt my pulse turn hard and slow. Why? Her eyes lifted to mine, steady now in a way they had not been a minute earlier. Fear was still there, but underneath it was choice. The grandfather clock in the library gave a dry, accusing click before the next second fell. I kept my eyes on Evelyn Hart and waited for the answer she had been carrying for years like a blade wrapped in cloth. Because she said if he ever looked at me too closely, he'd know, Evelyn Hart said. The fire behind the iron grate shifted low and red. Dust floated through the lamplight above the old albums spread across my desk, and for one beat I heard nothing except the soft hiss of burning wood and the blood moving in my ears. I had spent my life around liars, traitors, and men who hid knives and favors. But this felt different. This felt older, colder. Not a sudden betrayal, but a careful burial. Know what? I asked. Evelyn Hart pressed her thumb against the teacup so hard I thought the porcelain might crack. She never told me that part. Only that my childhood had to stay simple on paper. Small towns, boarding records. No photographs before I was 6 except the ones she kept locked away. That answered one question and opened 3 more. The woman in the album was no passing resemblance. The line of the jaw, the eyes, the shape of the mouth when she was not smiling, it lived again in the face across from me. Coincidence had been the excuse. Now coincidence was dead. I pulled the album closer and turned the next page with more care than I gave most firearms. 2 sheets near the center had been ripped out cleanly, not with age, not by accident. The binding threads were cut, not broken. Someone had used a blade. Under the torn edge sat faint pencil marks pressed hard enough to scar the paper beneath. Numbers. Initials. A date with the year smeared away. Evelyn Hart stood and moved beside my chair before I asked. That was the first moment the investigation stopped belonging only to me. The scent of rain still clung to her coat. Her shadow crossed the page with mine. Wait, Evelyn Hart whispered. Tilt it. I angled the paper toward the firelight. Indentations surfaced like bruises under skin. A single line became visible and mirrored pressure marks left from the missing page above it. H. Relocated before winter. Child not to be entered. For a second I forgot to breathe. I reached for the small magnifier I kept in the desk drawer and studied the margin. There, almost hidden inside a decorative vine, was a tiny notation in my father's hand. I knew his handwriting the way sons know old wounds. Paid through August. Silence required. The room went silent. My father had not merely known this woman. He had financed her disappearance from the family record. Evelyn Hart took one step back as if the floor had changed under her. My mother's first apartment lease starts when I was 7, Evelyn Hart said, voice thinning. Before that, every form says something different. Cleveland, Richmond, Tulsa, different churches, different schools. She told me we moved because men collected debts. I believed her because it sounded ugly enough to be true. I looked up. Do you remember any of it? Fragments moved across Evelyn Hart's face before words did. A long driveway. Stone lions. A woman singing somewhere far down a hall. And a man kneeling to button my coat. Evelyn Hart swallowed. I always thought I invented that. Not invented. Buried. I crossed to the filing cabinet built into the west wall and opened the lowest drawer, the one no one touched without my permission. Estate ledgers. Household wages. Repair logs going back 30 years. Old money documented everything, especially its sins. My pulse stayed controlled, but my hands moved faster than usual. I found the year I needed. Inside the household ledger, among salaries and deliveries, one line had been struck through in black ink so heavily it gouged the page. H. Hart. Nursery governess. Adjacent lodging approved. Special instruction from AVAV. My father. Evelyn Hart stared at the name as if it might vanish if she blinked. The ink looked wounded under the lamp, carved so hard into the paper that even a dead man's order still felt violent. I watched Evelyn Hart read the struck-through name, and for the first time since finding her photograph in my family's album, the silence between us did not feel like suspicion alone. It felt inherited. AV, I said. Evelyn Hart lifted her eyes to me slowly. Your father. Not a question. A judgment. The library seemed colder than the rest of the estate. All dark walnut, dust-soft rugs, and the stale dignity of money that had survived too many truths. I closed the ledger and slid it under my arm. Curiosity had carried me this far. Curiosity was no longer enough. If my father had placed a woman named Hart inside this house under special instruction, then someone had not merely hidden the record. Someone had tried to bury the reason. I want to see the oldest staff records, Evelyn Hart said. I looked at her. Not the ledgers, she said. The people. That changed the direction of the night. The 4 estate household staff had served this family long enough to know when a question was dangerous. By the time I called them into the morning room, rain had started tapping against the tall windows, and the fire threw unsteady gold over their faces. 3 stood with practiced caution. The 4th, the oldest among them, kept one hand on the back of a chair as if the room itself might tilt. I set the ledger on the table and opened it to the gouged line. Who was H. Hart? No one answered. The pause was not ignorance. I knew fear when I heard it breathing. Evelyn Hart said nothing. She only stood beside the mantel, shoulders square, her mother's name lying open between us like a blade no one wanted to touch. That was her choice, and it forced mine. I could have protected the room, kept this quiet, let loyalty smother truth one more generation. Instead, I let the silence rot. Answer me, I said, or walk out of this house and never come back. The oldest retainer flinched before the others did. Age had thinned his voice, but not his memory. Your father brought her here at night, he said. The room went still. He swallowed, eyes fixed not on me, but on the page. A woman and a little girl. Maybe 3 years old. Maybe 4. He said no one in the organization was to know. Not the 6 from the inner circle. No one. He said there were men inside the family business asking the wrong questions and taking money for the wrong loyalties. Evelyn Hart's fingers tightened at her side. I heard my own pulse in the quiet crack of the fire. Why hide them here? The old retainer drew a breath that sounded painful. Because the woman had seen something. That was the story given to us. She knew who arranged an attack meant to look like outside business. Your father said if word spread that she and the child were alive, internal enemies would finish it. A child. A hidden child. The words entered my body like cold metal. Was the child named Hart? Evelyn Hart asked. I never heard the child's first name, he said. Only that the mother was called Hart. Your father trusted her enough to keep her close, but not enough to leave her visible. She worked as a nursery governess on paper. In truth, she was under protection. Protection. In my family, that word had often meant a prettier form of prison. I turned another page in the archive box we had pulled from storage. Appointment cards. Holiday inventories. A household photograph with one figure cut cleanly from the edge. Then a baptism registry from the estate chapel, where one line had been scraped so thoroughly the fibers had nearly torn apart. Not crossed out. Removed. One woman had not been forgotten. One woman had been erased. Evelyn Hart stepped closer, her voice lower now. The chapel registry trembled between my fingers because the paper was older than both of us, and because the silence around that scraped-out name had started to feel alive. Dust floated in the yellow lamplight of the estate archive room. The old box on the table smelled like mildew, candle wax, and the kind of secrecy rich families mistake for order. Evelyn Hart stood at my shoulder, close enough for me to hear her breathing, and when she lowered her voice, I could feel the shift before I understood it. That wasn't random. I looked at her. The certainty in her face struck harder than fear would have. Until then, I had been chasing a question buried in my father's past. In that moment, Evelyn Hart was no longer just standing beside the question. She was standing inside it. Before I could ask what she meant, a knock hit the archive door. Not polite. Measured. 3 taps, a pause, then one more. One of the signals used by the Voss organization Inner Circle when they wanted privacy without witnesses. My pulse sharpened. I slid the registry back into the box and told Evelyn Hart to stay behind me. The man who entered wore a dark suit and an expression too empty to be harmless. He was one of the 6 men who had served my family long enough to know when my attention shifted. His eyes moved once to Evelyn Hart, then to the open archive box, then back to me. Nothing in his face changed. That was what made it dangerous. "There's a problem downstairs," he said. There always was. But this was the first time I heard the phrase as a test. I followed him into the west corridor, shutting the archive door behind me. The hallway was lined with oil portraits, dead Voss men watching with their usual contempt. The operative waited until we were out of earshot of the estate household staff before speaking again. "You've canceled 2 shipments in 48 hours, he said. "You pulled men off a collection route to review old records. And now the secretary is in restricted family storage." I said nothing. That makes people talk. The house had gone very still around us. Somewhere below, glass touched marble in the dining room. Somewhere outside, tires rolled over the estate gravel. Inside my organization, silence was never absence. It was calculation. "What people?" I asked. He gave me no names. He did not need to. In our world, suspicion spread faster than orders, and weakness drew knives before accusations were ever spoken aloud. People who think sentiment gets bosses killed. My jaw locked. "Get to the point." His gaze did not leave mine. "The point is that if she matters, she can be used." Cold moved through me then, cleaner than panic and more dangerous. I had spent years teaching men that leverage was the only language power respected. Now I was hearing my own doctrine spoken back to me with Evelyn Hart's life folded inside it. I went back into the archive room fast enough to make the lamp chain rattle. Evelyn Hart turned at once. She read my face before I said a word. "What happened? You're leaving the estate?" "No." The answer came so quickly it almost stopped me. There was fear in her eyes now. Yes, but it stood beside something stronger. Resolve. The same resolve that had brought her through records my father had tried to erase. "If I leave now," Evelyn Hart said, "whoever is watching will know they were right. They'll know I matter." "You do." The words came out harder than I intended. Her expression changed, not softened, but sharpened, as if the truth had finally stepped into the room with us. For one beat, neither of us moved. Then my phone vibrated. A message. No name attached, just an internal secure line used by the Voss organization Inner Circle. "Check the garage." I was already moving when I opened the second message. One choice. Protocol or her. The run through the corridor felt longer than the entire investigation had. Cold concrete threw back the sound of my shoes as I cut through the corridor and down the back stairs toward the garage. The message still burned on my screen. One choice. Protocol or her. By the time I hit the steel door, I had already decided I was done letting other people design my choices for me. The garage smelled like oil, rain, and old metal. One of the black sedans sat with its trunk open beneath a humming fluorescent strip, and inside was not a body, not a weapon, but a flat archive box tied with yellowing legal tape. I stopped so hard the box seemed to tilt in my vision. A trap would have been simpler. The tape had my father's private seal stamped into the dust. Beneath it lay hospital intake copies, a church registry page, and a death certificate that had been notarized 19 years ago. The paper was clean enough to preserve the lie and old enough to prove it had lived a long life. I saw one name immediately: Evelyn's mother. Listed as deceased on one record, transferred under a different maternal identification code on another, and attached to a payment ledger from one of our shell charities 3 weeks later. Not charity. Containment. Behind me, the door opened. I turned with my hand already near the pistol at my back, but it was Evelyn Hart, breathing hard, hair loosened by the run, one fist clenched around a manila envelope so tightly it had bent at the corners. Her eyes dropped to the box, then lifted to mine. There was fear in them, but not surrender. Not this time. "Move," she said. I stepped aside. She crossed to the hood of the sedan, dumped her envelope beside my papers, and spread the contents out with shaking fingers that became steadier the longer she looked at them. Her side of the truth was different from mine, and that was what made it dangerous. Mine came from locked rooms, family seals, and hidden accounts. Hers came from memory, from what people say when they think a child is asleep, from a storage unit bill paid in cash for 13 years, from an old photograph cut down the middle, and from a cassette tape she had somehow managed to digitize. I stared at the small recorder in her hand. My mother kept saying one phrase before she disappeared. Evelyn Hart said. I thought it was panic. It wasn't. It was an address. Then she pressed play. Static filled the garage first, soft and insect-like under the fluorescent buzz. Then a woman's voice, thin with fear, but clear enough to cut straight through bone. She said she had been told to report a death that had not happened. She said a child had to be separated for her safety. She said the Voss family could not know where the girl would be taken because someone inside the house had already been paid. The room inside me went still. I looked back down at the ledger. 3 payments authorized by a retainer account tied to my father. A 4th redirected through a household maintenance fund from the estate. That was the first moment the pattern changed shape. This had not been a clean order from one powerful man. It had passed through the house itself. You knew something, Evelyn Hart said, voice low and tight. Maybe not all of it, but you knew enough to keep me close. I could have denied that. It would have been easier, colder, and more familiar. Instead, I reached into my coat, pulled out the photograph from the album, and laid it between us. For the first time since this began, silence did not feel like a weapon. It felt like evidence breathing. Her face changed when she saw it. Not because she recognized me. We had never met then. It was the woman behind the children in the picture, one hand half visible near the edge, wearing a ring identical to the one in her cut photograph. Same narrow band. Same dark stone. That's my mother, she whispered. The ring caught the lamp first. A dull black stone set into a thin band, worn smooth at the edges by years of work and worry, and suddenly the air in my office felt thinner than the cigar smoke clinging to the curtains. I watched Evelyn Hart hold the photograph with both hands, as if too much pressure might break not the paper, but whatever truth had been sleeping inside it all these years. Her whisper still hung between us. That's my mother. I did not answer right away. I reached for the intercom instead. Bring Mara from the East Wing. Now. The order came out colder than I felt. Mara was one of the 4 household staff still left from my father's time, older than the walls seemed willing to admit, and for 6 days every question I had asked the estate had hit the same locked door. No one remembered. No one knew. No one had seen anything. But when Evelyn set that photograph under the lamp and the ring flashed like a buried signal, one memory rose above all the careful lies. Mara had once paused outside the library when I mentioned the album. Not long. Just long enough for guilt to cast a shadow. Evelyn looked at me, her fingers trembling once before going still. If that really is my mother, then why was she there? I kept my eyes on the door. That is what someone is finally going to tell us. The room fell quiet except for the clock and the rain tapping the tall windows. My inner circle had already tightened security around the estate after the attack on the archives. All 6 men spread across the property like a steel net, but this felt different from the violence before. Not an open threat, a hidden one. the kind that lived in old loyalties and unfinished orders. When Mara entered, she did not look at me first. She looked at the photograph in Evelyn's hands, and all the blood left her face. That was answer enough to begin. I stood, slow and deliberate, letting the chair scrape across the wood floor. Sit down. She remained standing. I said sit. Mara lowered herself into the chair across from my desk with the stiffness of age and fear. Rainlight silvered the lines in her face. She had served this family for decades. I had never seen her afraid of me until that moment. Evelyn slid the photograph across the desk without a word. Mara stared at it, then closed her eyes. I prayed this would burn before you found it. I leaned forward. Start talking. Her hands folded so tightly in her lap, the knuckles blanched. Your father gave an order after the Winter House killings. Not to kill a rival, to hide a child. The room went still. I felt Evelyn's attention sharpen beside me, not with panic now, but with terrible focus. Mara swallowed. There had been betrayal inside the organization. Someone close, someone trusted, sold movements, names, schedules. 3 people died in one night because of it. A woman among them almost did. She had a little girl. Your father believed the child would be hunted next, not for money, but because bloodlines could expose who had betrayed whom. I looked at the photograph again. The children in front. The woman half cut by the frame. A hand at the edge, ring visible. Evelyn, I said quietly, was that child? Mara nodded once, and Evelyn's breath caught hard enough for me to hear it. I had expected secrets. I had expected blackmail, forged records, maybe some forgotten affair my father had buried to protect his name. I had not expected this. A protection plan hidden inside a family portrait. A child placed at the edge of our history, near enough to be watched, far enough to be denied. Mara lifted shaking eyes to mine. Your father brought the girl to the estate for less than 1 hour. Long enough to create proof she had been under his protection if anyone ever questioned it. The rain had turned the estate windows black, each pane reflecting candlelight like strips of broken gold, and Mara's final words seemed to hang in that dim room long after her mouth stopped moving. For less than 1 hour. Long enough to create proof. My father had not hidden Evelyn Hart because he was ashamed of her existence near our family history. He had marked her for protection. That changed everything, and it changed it in the worst possible way, because protection only becomes necessary when danger already lives inside the house. I asked Mara one question. From whom? Her throat worked before any sound came out. Then she looked not at the old album, not at me, but toward the study door, as if the dead walls themselves might still be listening. She said my father had never feared rivals across the city as much as he feared ambitious men seated too close to his own table. Men who believed every weakness in the Voss bloodline had to be erased before it could be used. Men who had learned about a child attached, however quietly, to a sealed chapter of family history. Men who had not all died with the old regime. The room went still. I did not need her to give me all 6 names. I only needed the first 2, and the cold in my chest finished the rest. Patterns. Access. Missing files. Delayed reports. Security reassignments around Evelyn Hart that had looked like caution and now looked like positioning. I had spent years building power with men who knew how to survive by anticipating threats. Tonight I understood that some of them had survived by becoming the threat before anyone else could. Across the hall, Evelyn Hart stood in the doorway as if the truth had pulled her there by force. She had heard enough. Her face had gone pale, but not fragile. What struck me was not fear. It was recognition, the kind that arrives late and still cuts clean. She told me there had always been gaps in her childhood, places where her guardian would stop talking, names that vanished mid-sentence, records that never matched. Once, when she was 9, someone had tried to take her from a church parking lot in Baltimore. Her guardian moved them 3 states away the next week. She was told it was debt, bad luck, the kind of trouble poor families attract. It was never bad luck. It was a hunt. I was never supposed to meet you, she said. No one answered. Because the sentence landed with more force than a gunshot. If she had entered my office by chance, then chance had just broken a wall my father died trying to maintain. If the wrong men understood that she had been seen, recognized, and connected to the album, then Evelyn Hart was no longer a private risk. She was evidence with a heartbeat. I moved fast after that. Not outward. Inward. I sealed the estate gates. called the 6 men of the Voss organization inner circle into the lower conference room, and ordered the 4 members of the estate household staff into the service wing under guard, not as suspects, but to keep the circle from flushing prey through the house while they realized they had been exposed. I told Evelyn Hart to stay in the library with Mara and 2 armed watchers from the perimeter team. She grabbed my wrist before I left, her fingers cold and steady despite the tremor in her breath. If they were willing to erase a child, she asked, what do you think they'll do now? I looked at her and gave her the only honest answer. Worse. Steel and walnut, low lamps, 12 empty chairs, but only 6 occupied by the men who had helped me build my empire. Their faces were familiar enough to feel like family and distant enough to feel suddenly obscene. Steel and walnut, low lamps, 12 empty chairs, but only 6 occupied by the men who had helped me build my empire. Their faces were familiar enough to feel like family and distant enough to feel suddenly obscene. Rain tapped the tall windows of the estate like impatient fingers. The old album lay open on the table before me, its cracked leather dark under the light. Evelyn's face in that photograph staring up at men who had once sworn loyalty to my blood. No one spoke first. I let the silence do what threats could not. It settled on their shoulders, sank into their throats, forced each of them to sit with the evidence of a child turned into a secret. Then I slid a second item across the table, a brass estate key attached to a faded tag from the East Wing nursery. One of the household staff had brought it to me an hour earlier from a locked cabinet in the attic, along with a ledger page and 1 sealed letter that had never been mailed. Someone opens his mouth, I said, or I start deciding which one of you buried a child's life to protect your own. A chair creaked. One of the men from my inner circle looked at the key and went pale, but it was not one of them who broke. The oldest of the estate household staff stepped in from the doorway before anyone could stop him. His back was bent, his uniform pressed, his hands shaking hard enough to rattle the silver tray he had abandoned outside. He had served this house longer than I had been alive. He looked at me once, then at the photograph, and whatever fear had kept him quiet for decades finally lost to shame. It was your father, he said. The room went still. He swallowed. Not to harm her. To hide her. He ordered that the child be kept away from this family, away from this name, away from any record that could tie her to this house. He said if she stayed visible, she would be killed before she reached 10. I felt something cold move through my chest, colder than rage because it had shape. It had logic. It had years. He pointed at the photograph. Her mother worked here before she disappeared. She was not just staff. She was under your father's protection after she witnessed money moving through men outside the family. Men who wanted leverage. Men who learned she had a daughter. Your father split every trail in 2. The mother vanished to draw hunters away. The child was placed under another name and sent out with forged records through a church contact. No visits. No letters. No meetings. If anyone connected the girl to this estate, they would follow her. I looked down at the sealed letter. The paper was brittle at the fold. My father's handwriting cut across the envelope in hard, impatient strokes. For when it is safe. It had never become safe. I opened it. Inside was 1 page and a birth certificate copy tucked behind it. The certificate carried Evelyn's name, her mother's name, and a witness line signed by the same retainer now trembling in my dining room. My father's letter was shorter than I expected, almost brutal in its simplicity. If this reaches my son, then I failed to end it cleanly. The girl must never be brought here while the men who profited from Elena's silence still breathe. If Adrian sees her before the danger passes, he will keep her close. That will kill her. I read it twice. Not because I did not understand it, but because I did. That was why we had never met before. Not accident. Not chance. Deliberate distance. A wall built by a man I had spent half my life resenting, using the only kind of love he knew well enough to trust, separation. I lifted my eyes to the 6 men at the table. Who knew? 2 of them stood too late. My people at the walls moved faster.